Captain, the pings are getting closer.
Steady, Lieutenant. Hold this course.
January 1942. The North Atlantic is a vast, gray expanse, stretching endlessly under a low, brooding sky. Ice-laden waves lash against the steel hull of a German U-boat, pitching it violently as it cuts through the frozen waters. Inside, the officers huddle around dim, flickering lights, their breath clouding the air, hearts pounding in tense unison. Every shadow seems alive, every creak of metal a potential warning. Outside, invisible to human eyes, the Allies' sonar pulses ripple through the dark water. A faint, rhythmic ping, 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 echoes silently in the hull, each vibration a silent verdict, the U-boat's position betrayed. Officers glance nervously at one another, the unspoken fear in their eyes heavier than the cold pressing against the steel walls. Commands are whispered, decisions made with a mixture of precision and desperation. For the first time, technology, unseen and unyielding, has stripped away the safety of the deep, turning the ocean into a cage. The men feel the invisible hand of detection tightening around them, and a quiet terror settles over the crew. A revolution in naval warfare has begun. In the early months of the Second World War, the Atlantic Ocean was both a lifeline and a battlefield. The Allies relied on convoys to transport troops, fuel, and vital supplies from North America to Britain. Each ship was a thread in a fragile chain sustaining Britain's war effort, and each loss threatened to unravel it. For Germany, the Atlantic offered an opportunity. U-boats, submarines sleek, silent, and deadly, could sever these threads, starving Britain of the resources needed to resist. By 1940, the Kriegsmarine had already embraced the U-boat as its primary instrument of naval power. Submerged beneath the waves, these vessels prowled shipping lanes, invisible predators in the dark. Commanders calculated courses, depths, and firing solutions with precision, confident in the ocean's concealment. For months, they struck with near impunity, sinking hundreds of Allied ships and instilling fear across the Atlantic. Letters home spoke of relentless vigilance. Officers and crew knew every shadow could hide destruction. Yet for all their skill, a silent adversary was emerging, one that could pierce the very cloak of water shielding them. Across the Atlantic, British scientists and naval officers were quietly perfecting a technology known as ASTIC, soon to be called sonar. The principle was deceptively simple. Sound travels efficiently through water, and by emitting a pulse and measuring the time it took to return from an object, one could determine its distance and direction. In laboratories, engineers fine-tuned frequencies, calibrated receivers, and studied echo patterns. On test ranges, prototypes hummed through seawater, bouncing signals off submerged targets. Slowly, a weapon was being forged that did not rely on brute force, but on precision and observation. By 1941, sonar had begun to shift the balance of the Atlantic. While U-boats remained fast, silent hunters, they now faced an invisible net cast across their hunting grounds. Allied destroyers, corvettes, and patrol vessels were equipped with this new detection system, giving them the ability to locate submarines even in total darkness, fog, or storm. The ocean, once a refuge, had become a theater of uncertainty. German naval intelligence noticed changes before officers on the front lines did. Reports of U-boats mysteriously failing to meet their targets, of patrols lost without trace, began to circulate in the Admiralty. Commanders were puzzled. How could their carefully plotted attacks falter so consistently? Some dismissed the anomalies as bad luck or human error. Others began whispering of new Allied tactics, rumors of an enemy that could see underwater. Meanwhile, U-boat crews continued to operate under extreme conditions. Life beneath the waves was claustrophobic and relentless. Engines thrummed, hatches rattled, and the scent of diesel and sweat mingled in the air. Hours stretched into days as the submarine lurked at periscope depth, scanning for convoys, listening for distant engines, counting pings of distant sonar with nervous curiosity. Each successful attack was celebrated quietly, each failure analyzed obsessively. Commanders mapped the Atlantic, noting currents, depths, and the positions of Allied escort vessels, attempting to outmaneuver a foe whose capabilities they only half understood. The technological gap was not immediately obvious. Early sonar had limitations: shallow detection ranges, difficulty distinguishing between targets, and vulnerability to weather conditions. Yet the Germans underestimated its potential. What seemed like small, isolated incidents in early 1941 would soon compound into a strategic nightmare. Every missed torpedo, every lost convoy, every sonar ping became a note in a growing symphony of fear. By late 1941, the Allies had integrated sonar into coordinated convoy defense. Ships worked in unison. One vessel would sweep for submarines while others formed protective screens around merchant ships. Depth charges waited silently in racks, ready to turn sonar readings into sudden, violent destruction. German commanders, once masters of stealth, now faced an enemy who could locate them without ever seeing them. The Atlantic, a theater of shadows and silence, had become a crucible in which the traditional rules of naval warfare were being rewritten. From the icy decks of a German U-boat to the warm, brightly lit war rooms of the Admiralty, a quiet tension spread. Men who had once relied on instinct and experience were forced to confront a new reality. In war, technology could no longer be ignored. The ocean no longer guaranteed safety, and the hunters were now also the hunted. As 1942 unfolded, sonar's presence in the Atlantic became undeniable. German U-boat commanders, once confident in the invisibility of their vessels, began to sense an unseen threat. Convoys that should have been easy targets were slipping past, escorted by warships whose searchlights never even broke the darkness. Yet beneath the waves, the Allies heard everything. Sonar pulses, bouncing off steel hulls and twisting through cold currents, revealed the U-boat's positions with chilling precision. The first encounters were subtle but significant. A single torpedo failure could be dismissed. But when multiple attacks failed in succession, panic began to creep into command decisions. U-boat captains, trained for aggressive pursuit, found themselves evading threats they could neither see nor predict. Reports from the Atlantic trickled back to the Kriegsmarine headquarters in Berlin. Entire wolf packs had been forced to retreat, and some submarines were lost without a trace. The Admiralty's reports hinted at something extraordinary. They spoke of the relentless ghost of sonar, a force capable of striking silently from the depths. The Germans attempted several countermeasures. U-boats were instructed to dive deeper, maintain irregular courses, and attack only under the cover of night or in adverse weather. Some were fitted with rubber coatings in an early attempt at acoustic stealth. Tactics evolved rapidly. Wolf packs spread farther apart, and commanders relied increasingly on intelligence to avoid areas where sonar-equipped escorts operated. Yet every adjustment revealed the Allies' adaptability. Convoys now traveled with layered defenses, combining sonar detection, aerial reconnaissance, and coordinated depth charge attacks. Each U-boat engagement became a calculated gamble, where misjudgment could be fatal. Beyond tactical responses, the psychological impact on German officers was profound. Submarine commanders, once confident in their mastery of the ocean, experienced a new form of dread. Invisibility did not guarantee safety. Officers spent hours peering through periscopes, listening to sonar readings, analyzing echo patterns, and anticipating Allied maneuvers. The pressure was relentless. Every decision carried life-or-death consequences. Reports from returning U-boat crews described a subtle shift in morale. Some spoke of a silent hunter in the depths, a force that reduced strategy to guessing, courage to endurance, and confidence to anxiety. The Allies' mastery of sonar did not occur in isolation. Behind the technology were dedicated teams of engineers, sonar operators, and tacticians who meticulously analyzed enemy movements. They tracked patterns of U-boat behavior, predicted likely attack routes, and coordinated convoy defenses across vast stretches of ocean. By mid-1942, sonar had become a linchpin of the Allied anti-submarine strategy, and German naval officers were acutely aware that the ocean no longer belonged to them. One notable example occurred in March 1942 near the Mid-Atlantic Gap. A German wolf pack, comprising 6 Type 7 U-boats, attempted to intercept a slow-moving convoy. Unbeknownst to them, British destroyers equipped with ASTIC were already in position. As the submarines maneuvered into attack positions, the sonar operators detected multiple hulls beneath the waves. Depth charges rained down with calculated precision. 2 U-boats were destroyed outright. While the survivors were forced to retreat, their offensive neutralized. The reports that reached Berlin described a new kind of warfare, invisible yet unyielding. German Naval Command struggled to grasp the scale of the threat. In high-level meetings, admirals debated whether the sonar advantage was temporary or indicative of a permanent shift in naval warfare. Some clung to traditional confidence in U-boat stealth and crew skill, while others urged radical innovation. Every operational order reflected a growing tension. The need to maintain offensive pressure despite an increasingly lethal and unseen adversary. By late 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had transformed. Sonar-equipped escorts, coordinated air patrols, and intelligence breakthroughs forced German U-boats into a defensive posture. The oceans, once a domain where stealth and cunning dictated survival, were now arenas in which technology dictated terms. Commanders could no longer rely on instinct alone. They faced a silent, unyielding adversary beneath the waves, capable of revealing their every move. The ocean's depths, previously a sanctuary, had become a mirror reflecting both the ingenuity of the Allies and the vulnerabilities of German naval strategy. And within the tight confines of each U-boat, officers and crew felt the weight of an invisible threat, a constant reminder that in modern warfare, survival depended as much on evading detection as on firepower. At the heart of the Allies' growing advantage lay a technology invisible to the human, yet devastatingly effective. Sonar, known in the early war years as ASTIC. Unlike conventional weapons, it did not rely on sight or brute force. Instead, it exploited the natural properties of water, sending out acoustic pulses and listening for their echoes. Each ping provided exact data, range, depth, and direction of a submerged object. For commanders in the waterless abyss, it was a silent revelation. The technology evolved rapidly. Early sonar units had limited range and struggled in rough seas. Yet engineers continuously refined frequencies, improved detection cones, and trained operators to interpret subtle echoes. By 1942, sonar had transformed from experimental gadget to essential weapon, capable of tracking German U-boats as they hunted their prey. The ocean no longer guaranteed concealment. It had become a theater where sound, not sight, ruled. While sonar was mechanical, its effect on human psychology was profound. German officers and crews aboard U-boats faced a new type of fear, one without form, without visible enemy fire. In the dimly lit control rooms, eyes constantly scanned periscope views while ears strained to detect the faintest sound. Each sonar ping felt like an invisible hand tapping on the hull, exposing them. Officers whispered commands, yet hesitation crept in. Decisions that once flowed from instinct were now calculated against an unseen adversary. Journals from surviving U-boat commanders describe nights of paralyzing tension, a constant awareness that the deep waters themselves could betray them. Morale, once bolstered by skill and courage, wavered. The psychological strain was cumulative. Even seasoned officers began second-guessing every maneuver, every torpedo launch, every dive. Human fear had become as lethal as any weapon in the Atlantic. Sonar forced an immediate reevaluation of naval tactics. The Wolfpack strategy, once highly effective, now carried unforeseen risks. Coordinated attacks required U-boats to surface or maintain close formation, behaviors that became detectable. Submarines were ordered to dive deeper, vary courses, and attack under the cover of storms or darkness. Yet these measures were only partially effective. Allied ships adapted in turn, forming layered convoy screens with sonar-equipped destroyers at the vanguard, ready to intercept submarines long before they could strike. Every tactical decision was measured against the probability of detection. The ocean itself, once a tactical ally to the Germans, became a hostile environment. German commanders had to balance aggression with evasion, opportunity with survival. Each encounter, each maneuver, became a calculated risk with higher stakes than ever before. The introduction of sonar forced German naval leadership to confront a new reality. Traditional doctrine was no longer sufficient. Admirals and U-boat command officers faced unprecedented challenges in strategic planning. Decisions that once relied on experience and instinct now demanded careful consideration of technological limitations and enemy capabilities. In Berlin, the Kriegsmarine debated responses, weighing the benefits of continued aggression against the risk of catastrophic losses. High-ranking officers issued new orders. U-boats should operate in dispersed formations, increase depth during patrols, and employ evasive maneuvers more aggressively. Yet implementing these directives was not simple. Field commanders struggled with the tension between obedience and on-the-spot decision-making. The invisible nature of sonar meant that even small errors could lead to sudden, irreversible disaster, placing enormous mental pressure on leaders who had once felt invincible beneath the waves. From the Allied perspective, sonar represented a strategic breakthrough. British and American naval planners understood that defeating the U-boat threat required intelligence, coordination, and technological superiority. Destroyers, corvettes, and aircraft were trained to use sonar readings to anticipate submarine movements, often before the U-boats had any idea they were being tracked. Convoys were organized with multiple layers of protection, each ship assigned a specific role in detection, interception, and defense. Allied commanders meticulously studied U-boat behavior, identifying patterns in patrol routes, attack methods, and communication signals. This allowed them to turn sonar from a simple detection tool into a decisive element of offensive and defensive strategy. Each successful interception reinforced the Allies' confidence and exposed German vulnerabilities, creating a feedback loop that increased pressure on both sides. The invisible nature of sonar also introduced ethical and psychological dilemmas. Warfare, traditionally framed by visible threats, now included dangers that could neither be seen nor fully anticipated. U-boat crews experienced the terror of being hunted without warning, while Allied sailors wielded a form of omnipresent surveillance that made evasion nearly impossible. Some officers questioned whether this invisible method of combat was honorable, but survival and operational necessity overrode philosophical concerns. The moral burden fell unevenly. German crews bore the fear of sudden death, while Allied operators faced the calculated responsibility of detecting and destroying unseen adversaries. In both cases, the human cost was profound. Sonar, though a technological marvel, also reshaped the ethical landscape of naval warfare, demonstrating that innovation could amplify fear as effectively as firepower. May 1943. The North Atlantic churned under a cold, gray sky, the waves slamming against escort vessels with relentless force. German U-boats prowled the shipping lanes, confident in their calculated precision, unaware that a new reality awaited. Among them, U-569 and U-615 maneuvered into position, their crews silent, eyes trained on periscope and instruments. Every officer knew the stakes. A single miscalculation could mean sudden death in the icy depths. Yet this night was different. Unseen beneath the waves, sonar pulses radiated from British destroyers, cutting through darkness and fog alike. Operators detected subtle anomalies, echoes that betrayed the U-boat's positions with unprecedented clarity. Each pulse revealed the hunter's coordinates, turning the tables on centuries of naval doctrine. For the U-boat crews, the realization came slowly. The ocean was no longer their sanctuary. Orders whispered in the cramped control rooms were met with uncertainty. Evasive maneuvers felt increasingly futile, the once trusted silence of the deep replaced by a mechanical verdict that allowed no error. The first attack commenced at 22:45 hours. Depth charges detonated with a deafening roar, shaking the hulls and throwing men against steel walls. Officers shouted coordinates, desperate to evade, while sonar operators recalculated every movement in real time. One U-boat attempted a sudden dive to 90 meters, only to find the sonar-guided charges anticipating the maneuver. The vessel shuddered under repeated explosions, instruments rattling and lights flickering. Panic surged. Fear sharpened into instinct, but instinct was no longer enough. Across the Atlantic, other U-boats suffered similar fates. Convoys previously considered vulnerable now sailed under an almost impenetrable shield of technology and coordination. The Wolfpack tactic, once the cornerstone of German naval strategy, faltered. Submarines were forced into defensive patterns, dispersing across vast stretches of ocean to reduce detection risk. The commanders, trained for aggression, faced the bitter necessity of withdrawal. Reports from survivors conveyed a sense of awe and dread. The Allies were no longer reacting. They were anticipating, predicting, and controlling the flow of battle from the shadows. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Officers who had once exuded confidence now moved with a careful deliberation bordering on paralysis. Every sonar ping, every depth charge detonation was a reminder of vulnerability, an assertion that the ocean was no longer a neutral battlefield, but a controlled environment where technology dictated survival. Crew members, trained for endurance and courage, found their resolve tested in a new dimension. Fear not a visible enemy fire, but a mechanical predator lurking invisibly beneath them. By 23:30, the climax of the night's engagement had arrived. U-615, attempting to escape under a rain of depth charges, sustained critical damage to its propulsion system. Officers fought to stabilize the vessel, issuing emergency commands while sonar operators tracked every movement, anticipating each evasive turn. At 23:47, the submarine was forced to surface in desperation, only to be met by the coordinated fire of Allied destroyers waiting for precisely this moment. The U-boat surrender was not just a tactical loss. It was emblematic of a broader turning point in the Atlantic. The supremacy of sonar had been established. The implications reverberated beyond the immediate battle. German Naval Command, monitoring the reports from returning officers and intercepted communications, faced a strategic crisis. The technology that had once been experimental was now a decisive force. Losses mounted, confidence eroded, and traditional doctrines of stealth and surprise were rendered increasingly obsolete. The Atlantic, long considered a theater where skill and cunning dominated, had been transformed by unseen waves of sound. By the end of May 1943, statistical evidence confirmed the shift. Allied convoys lost far fewer ships, while U-boat attrition reached unsustainable levels. Operational records detailed how sonar-enabled escorts had detected and neutralized more than 25 submarines in a single month, often before they could attack. The tide of the Atlantic War, once a series of near-even exchanges, now decisively favored the Allies. The Germans, confronted by technology they could neither see nor easily counter, were forced into retreat and adaptation. Within the cramped, steel confines of the submarines, the fear lingered. Officers and crew had witnessed firsthand the transformation of their environment, from hunter's ocean to deadly trap. Every sonar ping, every echo, every detonation was a lesson etched into memory. Warfare had changed, and survival demanded more than skill. It required anticipation, adaptation, and a respect for the invisible forces shaping the battle. The events of that night set the stage for the broader, decisive shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Allies' mastery of sonar was no longer a tactical advantage. It was a turning point that reshaped naval operations and the very psychology of submarine warfare. The weeks that followed, May 1943 confirmed what German officers had begun to suspect. The Atlantic no longer belonged to them. Sonar, once a mere instrument in the Allied arsenal, had become the defining factor in naval engagements. Entire wolf packs, previously feared across shipping lanes, were neutralized before reaching their targets. U-boat commanders found themselves maneuvering not against human adversaries they could see and anticipate, but against a calculated, mechanical intelligence beneath the waves. The ocean itself had turned against them. One notable engagement occurred in the mid-Atlantic convoy routes. Convoy ONS 5, comprising 30 merchant vessels escorted by heavily armed destroyers and corvettes, became the site of a brutal confrontation. German U-boats, operating in multiple groups, attempted to penetrate the escort screen under cover of darkness. Yet from the moment they entered the sonar-detectable zone, the Allies had precise knowledge of their positions. Depth charges reigned with methodical accuracy. By dawn, 6 U-boats had been destroyed, and the remainder forced into retreat. Reports from German command were grim. Our submarines were outmatched, hunted even when unseen. The event became emblematic of the turning tide, a vivid illustration of how technology had redefined the rules of engagement. The impact on German naval strategy was immediate and severe. Wolfpack formations, once the backbone of U-boat operations, were curtailed. Submarines began operating in smaller, dispersed units to reduce detectability, a tactic that weakened offensive potential and limited coordination. Surface attacks, previously used to finish damaged merchant vessels, became increasingly rare. Every operational order reflected the new reality. The ocean could no longer be taken for granted, and aggressive action now carried existential risk. Commanders wrestled with difficult choices, balancing mission objectives against the near certainty of detection and destruction. The psychological toll on crews escalated. Officers and men who had once relied on instinct and experience faced unrelenting anxiety. Each sonar ping, each distant detonation, reminded them that concealment was no longer absolute. Survivors of these engagements later recounted the tension in the control rooms, the constant strain of listening, calculating, and anticipating the unseen enemy. Confidence eroded, and the ocean's once reassuring embrace became a claustrophobic trap. Morale, always fragile on long patrols, faltered as the realization sank in. Their enemy could locate them anywhere, anytime, without warning. For the Allies, the transformation was equally profound, though in the opposite sense. Sonar allowed them to shift from reactive defense to proactive control. Convoys sailed with greater confidence, knowing that submarine threats could be identified and neutralized before they inflicted damage. Destroyer captains learned to interpret sonar readings with precision, coordinating attacks across multiple vessels. Aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges extended the reach of this invisible net. The Atlantic, once a theater of chance encounters and stealth, became a calculated battlefield in which technology dictated both strategy and outcome. By late 1943, the cumulative effect was undeniable. German submarine losses reached record levels. Operational reports indicated that nearly half of deployed U-boats failed to return from patrols in the North Atlantic. The Kriegsharine's strategic objectives, crippling Allied supply lines, forcing Britain into submission, were increasingly unattainable. Every failed mission, every lost vessel, reinforced the reality that sonar had irrevocably changed naval warfare. Commanders had to accept that traditional tactics were insufficient. Survival now required evasion, innovation, and adaptation in an environment where every move was potentially exposed. The turning point extended beyond statistics and tactical maneuvers. It reshaped the very psychology of submarine warfare. The fear induced by invisible detection was a force multiplier, magnifying every risk and amplifying hesitation. Officers confronted an existential question. How does one fight effectively when the battlefield itself betrays every movement? The answer was partial and imperfect. Smaller groups, erratic courses, and reliance on intelligence. But the shadow of sonar remained, an unrelenting reminder that the hunter could now be hunted with certainty. As the Atlantic campaign evolved, it became clear that the era of unchecked U-boat dominance had ended. The night of May 1943 and subsequent engagements were more than isolated victories. They were the hinge on which the entire conflict in the Atlantic turned. The Allies' mastery of sonar not only neutralized the U-boat threat, but also forced the German Navy into a reactive posture, changing operational planning, morale, and the course of naval warfare itself. By the end of 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Sonar had shifted the balance, creating a decisive advantage that would endure for the remainder of the war. German officers, once confident in the stealth of the deep, were now perpetually aware that their every move could be tracked, their every strategy anticipated, their fate dictated by invisible waves of sound. In the Atlantic, the hunter had become the hunted, and the ocean itself had been transformed into an arena of precision, prediction, and unyielding technological dominance. The months following the decisive, sonar-enabled engagements of 1943 revealed the stark reality for the German Kriegsmarine. U-boat losses surged to unprecedented levels, and operational effectiveness declined sharply. Type 7 and Type 9 submarines, once feared across the Atlantic, were now increasingly vulnerable. Ships that previously relied on stealth could be located and destroyed before reaching their targets. The human cost was immense. Experienced crews, officers who had survived countless patrols, were lost beneath the icy waves, leaving a growing void in tactical knowledge and morale. Reports reaching Berlin from the Atlantic theater painted a grim picture. "We are hunted at all times," wrote one U-boat commander in March 1943, his words echoing the fear that had gripped crews across the fleet. Entire wolf packs failed to intercept convoys, while some submarines returned with heavy damage or empty-handed. The psychological toll on surviving officers was profound. Each patrol became a test of endurance, nerve, and judgment. Decision-making, once guided by instinct and training, was now clouded by anxiety, every sonar pinging a potential harbinger of destruction. Operationally, German naval strategy had to adapt. The wolf pack tactic, which had defined early successes in the Atlantic, was increasingly untenable. Submarines began operating in smaller, dispersed units to reduce detection risk, a shift that decreased offensive capability. Commanders were forced into defensive postures, retreating from areas patrolled by sonar-equipped escorts and air cover. Routes previously considered secure were abandoned, and strategic objectives, such as disrupting the steady flow of Allied supply convoys, were rarely achieved. The Allies, by contrast, consolidated their technological advantage. Sonar-equipped escorts, coordinated with intelligence networks, air reconnaissance, and aerial depth charge attacks, created a multi-layered system that dramatically reduced shipping losses. Convoys that had once been vulnerable now reached their destinations with far fewer casualties. Statistical data underscored the shift. By mid-1943, U-boat sinkings had spiked while Allied shipping losses had dropped significantly. The Atlantic, once a contested arena, had tilted decisively toward the Allies. The psychological effect on German officers extended beyond individual fear. Commanders at the highest levels of the Kriegsmarine were forced to reassess operational doctrine. Sonar had demonstrated that technology could outmatch experience, rendering traditional methods insufficient. Strategic debates in Berlin revolved around how to counter this new threat. More aggressive tactics risked annihilation, while retreat signaled a loss of initiative. In every case, the invisible hand of sonar dictated choices, altering the rhythm of command and redefining the nature of submarine warfare. Losses were not only tactical, but symbolic. Ships that had once sailed with impunity were now being hunted with relentless precision. U-boat crews, once confident in their mastery of the sea, began to question the efficacy of their training, the reliability of their equipment, and the wisdom of their commanders. Letters and journals from returning sailors capture the pervasive sense of vulnerability. They describe nights spent in tense silence, listening for faint pings that might betray their position, hearts pounding with the knowledge that detection could come at any moment. The human dimension of this technological shift was profound. Fear and uncertainty had become as lethal as torpedoes or depth charges. By the end of 1943, the operational consequences were clear. German U-boats, once instruments of terror on the Atlantic, had been forced into defensive patterns, their impact on Allied supply lines dramatically reduced. Commanders struggled to adapt, improvising tactics to mitigate losses, yet every innovation seemed met by an Allied countermeasure. The balance of power had shifted. What had begun as a technological experiment, sonar, had matured into a decisive factor shaping the outcome of the Atlantic War. The experiences of these months laid the groundwork for the final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. They demonstrated that technological innovation, combined with disciplined coordination and strategic foresight, could overturn traditional advantages. For the German Kriegsmarine, the message was unambiguous. The ocean was no longer a refuge. Every move, every decision, every patrol would now occur under the watchful, unyielding scrutiny of sonar. Survival demanded adaptation, ingenuity, and a new respect for the invisible forces that had reshaped naval warfare forever. The long-term consequences of sonar's dominance reshaped the Atlantic theater and the Kriegsmarine strategic outlook. By late 1943, German naval planners acknowledged that traditional U-boat tactics were no longer sufficient. Entire operational doctrines required revision. The Wolf Pack, once the pride of German naval strategy, had been fragmented. Submarines operated in isolation or small groups, moving erratically to evade detection. While this reduced losses, it also severely limited their offensive potential. Key supply routes, previously vulnerable, remained largely intact, allowing the Allies to maintain the logistical lifeline that sustained Britain and supported broader war efforts. In response, Germany pursued countermeasures. Acoustic decoys, such as the Bold system, cylindrical canisters releasing bubbles to confuse sonar, were deployed in increasing numbers. Rubber coatings intended to dampen sonar reflections were applied to some U-boats. Tactics shifted toward night attacks on less protected convoys or operations in regions where Allied air cover and sonar patrols were limited. Yet these adaptations were only partially effective. Allied technological innovation consistently outpaced German countermeasures, and every new strategy met with a corresponding defensive adjustment. The dynamic underscored a critical reality. Sonar was not a temporary advantage, but a permanent transformation of naval warfare. The impact on morale and command was equally significant. German officers, once confident in their control over the Atlantic, now faced an invisible adversary capable of exposing every maneuver. Letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies reveal a pervasive anxiety among crews. The psychological pressure was compounded by rising losses of experienced personnel. Every patrol risked not just mission failure, but permanent destruction, creating a tension that weighed heavily on decision-makers. Even seasoned commanders hesitated, wary of the unseen eyes listening beneath the waves. For the Allies, the effects were transformative. Sonar, integrated into coordinated convoy defense, allowed the safe passage of troops, raw materials, and critical supplies across the Atlantic. Convoy escort groups became increasingly sophisticated, combining sonar with radar, intelligence from decrypted communications, and coordinated aerial reconnaissance. The synergy of these tools enabled proactive engagement with U-boats, allowing the Allies to dictate the tempo of the Atlantic campaign. By the close of 1943, the battle lines had shifted decisively. The hunter had become the hunted, and the Kriegsmarine's once dominant force was now constrained by technology it could neither evade nor fully counter. The broader strategic implications were undeniable. The reduction in Allied shipping losses allowed for the buildup of forces in preparation for operations in North Africa and later the Normandy invasion. Sonar had thus influenced not only naval engagements, but the wider trajectory of the war. German attempts to regain initiative through innovation, aggressive patrols, or tactical improvisation were constrained by the persistent technological advantage held by the Allies. The Atlantic, a theater of fear and uncertainty, had become a testing ground for the decisive role of intelligence, technology, and coordination in modern warfare. In retrospect, sonar reshaped both the tactical and human dimensions of the conflict. Submarine crews adapted to a world in which silence no longer guaranteed safety, while Allied sailors embraced technology to extend their reach and effectiveness. Commanders on both sides recalibrated expectations, strategies, and risk assessments. The psychological burden on German officers, the constant knowledge that every move could be tracked, was as decisive as any physical engagement. Sonar had transformed naval warfare from a contest of skill and stealth into a contest of prediction, control, and technological supremacy. By the close of 1943, the evidence was unmistakable. German U-boat operations were no longer the dominant threat they had been in the early war years. Allied control of the Atlantic was secured not merely by brute force, but by the precision and foresight enabled by sonar. The technology had rewritten the rules of engagement, forcing Germany into a reactive stance and ensuring that the oceans were no longer a neutral battleground, but a domain of calculated, relentless oversight. The events set the stage for the final reflection on the broader meaning of this technological revolution and how invisible detection reshaped the human experience of naval warfare. The story of sonar and the Battle of the Atlantic is not just a tale of technology, but a study of human resilience, fear, and adaptation. Beneath the endless gray waves, men confronted forces they could neither see nor fully anticipate. U-boat crews, trained in stealth and precision, learned that mastery of the ocean was no longer enough. Every echo, every mechanical pulse, reminded them of their vulnerability. Their courage was measured not only in torpedo attacks, but in the endurance of uncertainty, an invisible adversary reshaping every decision, every breath, and every heartbeat. For the Allies, sonar demonstrated the power of innovation applied with discipline. Intelligence, coordination, and technology converged to create an advantage that extended beyond hardware. It dictated strategy, morale, and the rhythm of the Atlantic War. Sonar turned uncertainty into control, fear into opportunity, and the ocean from a contested space into a theater of calculated dominance. Its impact was profound, redefining what it meant to fight, survive, and succeed in modern warfare. Yet beyond strategy and statistics, there is a human lesson. The silent pulses of sonar remind us that in war, invisibility can be both weapon and terror. The line between hunter and hunted blurs, and survival often depends as much on anticipation and understanding as on brute force. Technology reshapes not only battles, but the psychology of those who wage them. The fear it instills is real, palpable, and enduring, a shadow beneath the waves that cannot be escaped. In the end, sonar represents a turning point in history. It transformed the Atlantic, shifted the balance of power, and revealed the limits of human intuition when faced with unseen forces. But it also reminds us of the human spirit under pressure. The officers, the crews, the minds adapting to a new era of warfare. The invisible currents of sound beneath the ocean tell a story of fear, ingenuity, and survival, echoing far beyond the cold waters of the North Atlantic into the broader understanding of technology, warfare, and humanity itself.